This is the panel right after lunch, so I may have you do jumping jacks right in the middle of it, we'll see. But you're here to hear about regional transportation systems, and we are very thankful that this panel has been sponsored by AECOM, so thank you so much for that. Let's talk about regional transportation systems. I wanted to start by giving you a little context about our region. And I know not all of us are from the Baton Rouge region, but that's kind of what I'm going to talk about for this initial part, because our region is growing. And really, if you look at the travel, across parish lines, it's happening on a more and more frequent basis, and commuters are having to commute longer and longer. We saw that earlier, the slides that show that there's so much more commuting happening between New Orleans and Baton Rouge and Houma, and it's happening on a daily basis. And then, of course, we have the industrial boom, which is creating new jobs in more remote locations along the river. And in addition to having a higher than average number of households without access to a personal vehicle, the Capital Region has the nation's third highest roadway congestion for our size. And I'm sure so many of you could already, you didn't even need those statistics because you're probably spending more and more time getting to your jobs or just getting around the city than you did, 10 years ago. So congestion across the greater Baton Rouge area costs the region $623 million per year in wasted time, productivity, and fuel. Just imagine if we had that amount of money to work with to improve our system. But because fuel economy has increased dramatically and people are generally driving less, particularly millennials and older Americans, less gas tax is being generated, which means the funding source available to maintain or improve our infrastructure is actually decreasing, not increasing. Meanwhile, there are multiple projects in the queue with hefty price tags, loops and bridges and maintenance projects that seem a long way off in actually solving traffic congestion. And so determining how best to invest our scarce transportation dollars takes coordination across multiple agencies, such as the State Department of Transportation, the Metropolitan Planning Organization, the MPO, transit agencies, city departments, and not to mention the airports and ports. So we're going to hear from our panelists today about how important some of these collaborations are across sectors and across agencies. And then congestion really affects how livable our communities are. Too many people lack options for getting around or are experiencing those longer commutes. And it affects our region's viability as a place to do business and attract further investment. The ideal goal is to get to a place where our investments are supporting that economic growth and quality of life. Transportation has really been a top priority for CPEX's work with our Connect initiative, which is looking at connecting jobs and houses across the New Orleans and Baton Rouge region. And we've also formed a new partnership with the Baton Rouge Area Chamber and the Greater Baton Rouge Industrial Alliance to form a new coalition called the Capital Region Industry for Sustainable Infrastructure Solutions, or CRISIS Coalition. And so the purpose of all this work is to bring focus to the needs and priorities so that we can all be on the same page about how to invest our limited transportation dollars. So we're so pleased today to have the panelists tell us how they've solved all of these problems in their regions. But really, we're looking forward to hearing about their experiences and thinking about how we can apply what they've learned to our own efforts with transportation across the state. So I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. We have Bridget Massengale, who lives in Chattanooga, and she's the local project manager for Thrive 2055, which is a citizen-led public-private endeavor to engage people from across the 16-county, get this, tri-state Chattanooga region of Southeast Tennessee, Northwest Georgia, and Northeast Alabama to make the most of economic opportunities while preserving the best of their communities. She does outreach across this entire region. I don't know when she sleeps. But prior to this, she was principal of her own consulting firm, and she's been dedicated to downtown commercial revitalization efforts, and also worked as a legislative budget analyst specialist for the Tennessee General Assembly. Then we have Christopher Zimmerman from Smart Growth America. He's their Vice President for Economic Development and Director of the Governor's Institute on Community Design. And Smart Growth America's sister organization is Transportation for America. I really invite you to go check out their website and sign up for their blog if you're interested in these types of issues. Both organizations have been a great friend and a resource to CPEX. Chris's work focuses on the economic and fiscal impact of development policies on localities and regions. And prior to joining Smart Growth America, he was involved in planning, development, and transportation policy in Arlington County, Virginia. And so he's going to tell us about some of his efforts and works there. But I also want you to know that Smart Growth America also compiled a report on the innovative MPOs across America. And they named the Maricopa Association of Governments that our guest Dennis Smith represents as one of the most innovative for economic competitiveness. So we also have Dennis Smith here today, who is the executive director of that Maricopa Association of Governments, MAG, which represents 27 cities and towns, 3 Native American Indian communities, and the Maricopa and Pinal counties of Arizona. And Dennis has been involved in numerous regional achievements, including the development of the regional 911 system, the development of several major transportation funding efforts, and his other efforts include forming the MAG Economic Development Committee, focusing on making the Maricopa region and Sun Corridor more globally competitive. So thank you so much. We'll hear from our panelists now.
It's kind of a long walk. Good afternoon. Let's try that again. Good afternoon. I know you had a big lunch and all that. It's the only thing harder than giving the talk right after lunch is the one before lunch. But so hopefully everybody's well fed now. Thank you very much for the opportunity to talk today. As Rachel said, I have a sordid background. I'm a recovering politician, so you know that. I'm an economist by profession. Oftentimes I go to places and I have to say, I'm a former politician, I'm an economist, and I'm here from Washington to help you. And of course, then nobody's going to trust anything I have to say. But for what it's worth, in this case, it does let me talk with some experience about some of these issues. In particular, that the time I served about 18 years in local government in Northern Virginia, in the Washington, D.C. area, and there were 5 of us, and early in my career there was a vacancy on the transit board, and I was the only one that could go to the meetings. So I got that assignment, which was fine because I wanted to do that. And then there was a number of people left, and every time there was a transportation assignment in some regional capacity or another, which there are a lot of, they said, well, you're already doing that one, so you should do this one too. And after a while, I was on every transportation body in the metropolitan region on which a local official might serve, which was good in some ways and challenging in others. I got the opportunity to serve on the Metro Board, which is the transit body that runs the subway in DC, for 13 years. I served on our MPO, which is called the Transportation Planning Board, for 15 years. I served on the commuter rail. We have Virginia Railway Express as our commuter rail system, and I served on that for 15 years. I served on the Northern Virginia Transportation Authority, which I'll talk about a little bit, from its inception in 2002 till my retirement in 2014. And I served on a bunch of others, but you're going to get bored with this alphabet soup really fast, but mostly make the point that there are a lot of these things, and that is illustrative of the issue, actually, in regional transportation in the United States, and what I want to talk about a little bit. So I did get the opportunity to become a little bit expert in the regional transportation planning and coordination issues in my region. About a year ago, I was teaching a course at the planning department in Virginia Tech. Can you say Virginia Tech in Baton Rouge? Well, I guess it's okay. We're so bad this year, no one will care. But the planning department's doing better than the football team these days. And I was teaching this class on regional planning and coordination, and so, you know, you have to make things applicable not just in the jurisdiction you're in, but all the places these people might work when they get their, you know, their master's degrees and go out. And I spent a lot of time trying to identify lessons that are in some way universal in this world, at least across the United States, in metropolitan areas. And it is my considered opinion that that is very hard to do. That the problem in talking about regional transportation across the country is that there are so many unique circumstances institutionally that it's a challenge to come up with lessons that work for everybody. On the other hand, the problems that you're dealing with are very common, and some of the solutions are relevant in all places, or at least relevant in some other places. So I think there are things to learn if you're working in your own region from other regions, but it's not easy to take what they did and, you know, just snap it in, plug and play where you are, because almost every place will find that it has some very unique circumstances. Let me start there, that generally. The whole idea of regionalism in the US is kind of a fraught concept. We don't really have an institutional history of regional governance in the United States. We have state governments, which were the center of everything from the first Constitution, and we have local authority under those state laws and under state constitutions, and the stuff in between is problematic. Now, it didn't matter much for a long time, but it came to matter a lot in the 20th century. But we weren't really well equipped for that. One way that can be handled, and is handled in other countries, is that as things grow, you expand the area of governance, the jurisdiction, and mergers and consolidations and things like that can happen, but haven't really happened very much in the U.S. It's a difficult concept and a difficult thing to struggle with. There are a number of different examples around the country, but for the most part, in most places in the country, there's one main vehicle through which regional governance occurs. It's in transportation, because it has to be, because they have to do it, and it's largely MPOs, which are basically a creature of federal legislation. Just to note that, again, you could merge in governments, and there have been a few examples of that. There are some prominent ones. I believe we are in one here. If I understand, Baton Rouge merged with its parish or something like that some time ago. There's big ones known are Nashville, Davidson, Indianapolis, Marion County, which happened about 4 decades ago. A few other places. I worked in Macon County, the city of Macon, Bibb County merged about 2 years ago or so in Georgia. So there are some examples, but they really are exceptional. There haven't even been that many referenda in the course of a century, and 3/4 of them failed. So, that tells you we have a little bit of a problem with that. We don't like to change our structures very much. So for the most part, we do planning on a cooperative basis. It has to be largely voluntary. Really, we've gotten regionalism around transportation and nothing else for the most part, I would say. Because we don't actually, there's a lot of things that would be good for us to cooperate on, and in some places you do get good cooperation, particularly for recruiting on economic development. But for the most part, housing policy might be good on a regional basis, but nobody has to do it, so they don't. Transportation is a different kind of thing. The highway actually has to meet at the county line, right? So that has to happen, and if that weren't enough, then you have the simple fact that the federal government is going to make you do it. And so we have this system that is really based on transportation funding and rules that go along with the funding from the federal level. Just to note that historically, cities were self-contained places. They had urban growth boundaries that were called walls, and you had a clear divide between city and country. The municipality was a fundamentally different thing than area around it, wherever it occurred. But over time, we didn't need walls around cities, and they grew for all kinds of reasons, driven in many cases by transportation. This happens to be the city I work in, which is Washington, D.C., but shown about 120 years ago. And if you know D.C., the whole white area there is the District of Columbia. On the left side, that's Arlington, where I live. But in 1892, the area that's kind of shaded and built out, you can see that really was the city for 100 years in the capital, because the rest of it was basically countryside. And what happened right around there, you can see with some of the lines, the red lines and so on that appear, that are streetcar lines that began to drive development to different places. But for the most part, up until well into the 20th century, that really was occurring within the city boundaries, and that's representative of a lot of places. It was really only as transportation made it possible and development began to spread out, particularly as a result of urban highways and the federal funding in the 50s, that we really saw a tremendous expansion of regional areas. And so you could say to some degree, the need for regionalism is a product of sprawl, because to some degree, that's the case. We're then in different jurisdictional boundaries, and while there was immediately talk about merging things, that mostly didn't happen. So, it's not a new thing. The idea of, regional connectivity through transportation, creating, different communities and kind of a network goes way back. This is for those of you planners in the room and who Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement, this was something drawn out in the late 19th century that was essentially about that idea. Now they were assuming railways because they didn't have superhighways and they didn't have cars then, but it's not different in many ways than models drawn more recently. But the reality was that you were in different jurisdictions then, and getting those folks to coordinate is not a simple matter. So what happened basically in this country is that we didn't do much about it until we had to, and we had to when the federal government in the 20th century, starting in the 1920s, really got more and more into funding roads. And in doing so, having the ability to lay down certain rules. Obviously, if they funded them, they wanted to make sure they actually did connect, and that was kind of the in. And they imposed early on some planning requirements, and that planning on any level was a new thing then. And the original idea was for extensive regional planning, and in the beginning there were some fairly significant efforts that didn't necessarily hold up. For one thing, it stimulated, for instance, in the New York area, the biggest metropolitan area at the time, an actual tri-state planning agency that lasted for quite a while, but wound up breaking up ultimately into the individual states. So, on the one hand, federal legislation and federal funding resulted in empowering states, which in the beginning of the 20th century were the weakest form of government, basically, the weakest level of government. There was more money, at the local level, and more influence. States became more important in part because of the growing role of the federal government providing funding and doing things through the states, and transportation being a key area. So in transportation, they essentially empowered state departments of transportation, and state departments of transportation wound up being big drivers, whether they acknowledged it or not, whether they recognized it or not, in urban planning and economic development. They weren't necessarily engaged in those planning efforts, but the fact of what they were doing had a tremendous impact. On the other hand, federal law also, in some ways, created, as I said, this regional planning on a metropolitan level, especially once these evolved ultimately into the MPOs we know today. So that's something of an irony, and then the more interesting part of it at the moment is that with the federal government withdrawing so much from funding, that we have something of a reverse process, and what's happening is state DOTs and MPOs are having to find new ways to do things, and that's a little bit what you're going to hear from the two speakers following me, is about kind of creative efforts that people are trying to make to deal with the new funding reality, recognizing you still are going to have to cooperate regionally to get anything done. But for the most part, as I said, it's a lot about MPOs, and in a crowd like this, I was hesitant to try and do too much schooling in MPOs. There are some people in the room, who know about it and don't need to hear anymore, and there are a lot of people who don't know about it and don't need to hear anymore, because this becomes arcana really quickly. But I do want to just touch on a couple of the salient features of this system we have that relate to the difficulties in getting coherent regional policy, and the fact that all of this is a response to this institutional structure we have. So on the kind of the purest level, if you're in a jurisdiction in which the metropolitan area is entirely located within one state, you still have all kinds of complications. Again, with the spilling out of growth beyond any municipal boundaries. This is kind of a schematic diagram that is actually from the Federal Highway Administration. This is to make it simple for you to understand. And in case it doesn't, let me try to point out a few things. If you look at the areas highlighted here, what you'll see is there's essentially a developed area shown as kind of a blob. There's a municipality A, so think of that as the center city, which is one jurisdiction. It exists in a county, which is one county, but the area of growth extends to different counties. So you've got more than one municipality within one county, and then you've got growth going into other counties as well. And if you see the thing on the left, you can see you've got municipality C and B. And around an urban center. It's very complex. And this is a simplified schematic, basically. And it also has the advantage of being in a place where you're only in one state. And to the extent that you have that, be thankful, because it's complicated enough. We do have metropolitan areas that straddle borders, and that makes it a lot more complicated. Bridget is going to tell you about her situation in being in 3 states, centered in one of them, but with a lot of their area being really in 2 other states, and that is our situation in Northern Virginia as well. So then it gets a lot more complicated. Of course, these are different for different size jurisdiction, but there's a system covering all of that. Here's one that's Kansas City's, which is called the Mid-America Regional Council, and again illustrates that you've got jurisdictions on 2 sides of a state line, very complex, large population with a couple of million people spread out over a lot of area. And on the other hand, the cities that are centered on, in this case Kansas City, Missouri, is really a small fraction of the population of the whole. So you don't even have the centrality that you once had, because that's where metropolitan areas have devolved. Atlanta, on the other hand, is entirely in one state, but it is a huge area with a lot of different jurisdictions. In Virginia, let me say, this is a smaller area, but let me just show you Virginia. So those dark areas that are highlighted, those are different MPOs within my state. And you'll notice at the lower left and at the upper right, those are MPOs that extend to different states, the one at the upper right being the one that I served on that covers the Washington, D.C. area, which is called the Transportation Planning Board, and I think I have a picture of that. No, that's just Northern Virginia, sorry. This is it, yeah, okay. So this is what we call TPB. You can't probably make it out, but D.C.'s in the middle there, and the Potomac River divides the region. Anyway, it's big, it's complicated, it has a lot of different jurisdictions, and it ostensibly plans transportation in the region. The truth of the matter is it doesn't really plan anything. People think it does, and we act as if it does, and we talk to people if it does, but it really doesn't. One of the issues with it that may be unique to it, but in my experience, MPOs vary a lot. Some of them are actually powerful bodies in which the people who serve in that capacity are also serving in important capacities in local and state government, and they really are making the decisions there. In the case of the MPO for the Washington area, that's complicated in part by this fact of straddling borders, because to start with, remember that the locus of power in transportation is basically the state, and in this case, we don't have either state capital there. The state capitals are, in Richmond and Annapolis outside this area, and they drive to a large degree the planning. But since planning has to be done on a state level anyway, because it comes down from, under this federal system, a state level plan, and funding goes through that ultimately for most projects, the state plan becomes the key. This has led to a criticism of one active person in the Washington area who called TPB, our MPO, the big stapler. And what he was saying is all they're really doing with all these meetings is taking the plan that's dreamt up in VDOT and in MDOT and in the district's Department of Transportation and putting them together. And that is a pretty valid critique, I think. And it's not easy to say how that would be solved or whether it would be entirely good if it were. which is to say that given the institutional reality that you have state-level planning and, and transportation systems and a federal funding system, it's hard to see how you make this body then become the actual, regional governing body, because it isn't really constructed for that either. Nonetheless, it has to do things, it has to coordinate things, and some good does come of having all these people in the same room once a month or more to talk about these things, to review them. And it does actually play a role, but it isn't the role people often think. It isn't really where the decisions are made. Again, that's different than in some other MPOs. But as you look around the country, either in your own circumstance or because you're interested in what someone else is doing, you have to think about that. How does that apply here? And it's going to vary a lot. So one of the sort of solutions to this is sub-regional planning. And let me say, even in places where you have one MPO covering a large territory, there's always the question of how many MPOs should there be. There's always people wanting to break off and form their own MPO. And so, sometimes that's what they do. Sometimes they try to hold them together, but allow for kind of some sort of sub-regional transportation planning and policy making. And in our region, that made a lot of sense simply because, again, if you're in Northern Virginia and you're one of the, there's 2 million people in the area shown up there, you're going to try and get something done in an area where the state is very powerful, where most of the roads are actually controlled by the state. You have to work on that level. So what Northern Virginia wound up doing, what the Commonwealth of Virginia wound up doing for Northern Virginia ultimately, was creating a regional system. Now this is partly because with declining funds, and I'm talking about declining federal funds, but our state government had a big transportation push in 1986. And that was the last time until 2013 that any funds were raised. That's the last time they raised the gas tax or any other significant funding measure was made. So we were losing state money in a big way after 25 years of that. The problem was in part because this is a really big issue if you live in this area, because Northern Virginia transportation is always in crisis, and it's kind of a big deal to do something about. But on the other hand, the rest of the state, not so much. So people in other parts of the state don't want to vote to raise the gas tax when it isn't the issue that's crisis for them. So again, struggled a lot with the idea of can we empower the region, a controversial issue. Ultimately, they created a transportation authority, which was part of building credibility for raising new revenue and funding new projects. And that was done by putting together the 9 major jurisdictions of Northern Virginia into a new entity that is an authority with powers to plan, to implement, to issue bonds, to do by contract or directly, basically any kind of transportation project. It was legislation passed in 2002. It had it gave a lot of inherent power to the authority. The one thing it didn't do was fund it. And without dollars, none of that mattered for anything. So instead of having this theoretical power to do a whole lot, what we had was about $50,000 or something from the state to do planning. And so for a bunch of years, what we mostly did was say, if we had money, here's what we do. But that was actually important in trying to build credibility to ultimately get funding. And we developed a program, a plan based on corridors, showing how it's a regional system, how it would connect the region together, and showing what the kind of priorities there would be. We did that through a lot of outreach, a lot of interaction with the public. And it took a lot to kind of get through distrust and get people supportive, a lot of participation from the business community and broader range of folks that helped us to, in a couple of efforts, to get the General Assembly to finally pass legislation that would provide funding for that. And I won't go into all the details, but it took over a decade before we actually got the funding to do any of this because of so many of the problems. But when we were ultimately successful in 2013, I think a large part of that was because of the time spent showing how the plans made sense, showing that the jurisdictions within the region were working together. Because of course, one of the things people would always say is, "Oh, they can't even get there. They don't. You can't expect them to even figure out how to do anything together. They're all doing their own thing." And people would think that whether it was true or not. This gave us a way to very visibly show we're all together. We've all agreed. we've put aside differences and we've got a plan we will all support to fund the future of transportation in our region. And as I said, it's not a simple process, but it ultimately was a successful one. So I think there are some lessons there. I would say that, again, there are lessons to be learned around the country in many of the creative things that people are doing in a lot of different areas. You'll hear two of them just now. And as Rachel mentioned, part of Smart Growth America, we're sort of an umbrella organization. We have other components. The National Complete Streets Coalition is us, the Governor's Institute on Community Design, Locus, which is the developers group that Chris Lineberger, who spoke a couple times today, is the president of. And Transportation for America is one of those components. And they do a lot of very interesting work. And they've been focusing a lot in the last couple of years on regional issues and working with MPOs. And they've issued a publication that I think Rachel mentioned that's called the Innovative MPO and gives a lot of different ideas about what's going on around the country. It's organized around 7 focus areas. You can't read all these, but it's just to give you the idea that it's everything from things like community engagement to using data to make your investments work better, to dealing with freight, and a variety of things. And it highlights a number of different communities. And as mentioned, Maricopa being one of the areas in which is kind of picked out. So I think you might find this useful. You can download it from the internet from the Transportation for America website, which is www.t4america.org. Although I bet if you Google Innovative MPO, it will come up, and you may find that a useful resource. In general, of course, we're happy if anyone would find our resources useful. You will want to look at smartgrowthamerica.org or contact us. We're happy to help in any way we can. And with that, I think I will say thank you and pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you very much.
So thank you for inviting me here to talk about the Phoenix region. And, this is the way that we do it. That doesn't mean that there aren't other ways to do this. This morning was very interesting to me. One of the things I did here that kind of did offend me a little bit was a slam against baby boomers. And so I was born in 1948, and I'm going to tell you a little story here. My parents, my father was kind of from the South. He was from Missouri, one of 14 kids. I think he was born in 1910. My mother, one of 11, from Minnesota. So those two parents grew up in the Depression. And so I was the son of a Depression parent. And I can tell you one thing, baby boomers that grew up with Depression parents got drilled into them how to go to work, because they knew that if they didn't know how to work, they were going to get laid off. And so my father was definitely all about that. So my dad was in the Civilian Conservation Corps, went to Montana to pick rock at Fort Peck Dam because that was the only job out there. My mother's farm in Minnesota went bust. Her older brother got on the Great Northern Railroad and homesteaded in Montana. And so my dad was not the reader. My mother was the reader. She was a voracious reader. So surprise to me when my dad recommended a book for me to read. And so I read the book. So this is the book. So I read that book. I'm going to talk later and pound our chest about how we built all this 181 miles of Centerline Freeway. Huey Long built over 2,000 miles of roadway here. So the seeds for success are in this state. I think you just need to pour some water on the seeds. I don't want to sound like Chauncey Gardner from the movie Bean there, but I think if you put the water in your garden, it can grow. Here's what we did. I think this is what's important to you folks here. So we were stuck in traffic back in 1985, just like you're stuck now. And so we made a deal with the business community, and we passed the first half-cent sales tax for transportation, I believe, in the United States. Right now, that's almost bringing $400 million into our region to build arterial streets, transit, and freeways. As I told a group at lunch today, if you don't go get your own money, you're basically a poser, you're not a player, your DOT is not going to pay attention to you. So you have to decide that you've had enough and that you want to do something about this. So we had to renew this tax in 2004. And so this committee that we put there, you see the slide that's up there now. So what happened was we had one of our mayors, the mayor of Phoenix, Skip Remza. Early on, my old boss used to say he was my paper boy. He was a realtor. And he came into our organization and said, hey, if you guys don't change the way you do business, nobody's going to listen to you because you're too insular. You've just got this technical planning process and you're really not out in the community. He wanted to put elected officials, or business community people on our regional council. We didn't think that was a very good idea, so we did a couple task forces. And I can still remember Valerie Manning, who was the head of the Phoenix Chamber. She was one of my friends. And she raised her hand in the meeting and said, Dennis, I don't want to be on your stinking regional council. I'm smart enough to know that before anything gets to that regional council, you've already baked the cake somewhere else. So where are you baking the cake for transportation? So we decided to restructure one of our committees, and we called it Transportation Policy Committee. I don't know if it's just unique to Arizona, but there was a lot of talk there about how elected officials don't get along and they always fight. Well, if you put 6 regional business people on that same committee, the fighting goes way down. If you have the head of Bank of America in Phoenix on that committee, all of a sudden it's time for the grown-ups to figure out what they're going to do. So I'm not going to read all these slides to you. This will be posted later. You can see how we put it together. 6 business people became the swing vote on our Transportation Policy Committee. This was not fed by a technical committee. They met, we did planning for 4 years. They met for a year. No meeting lasted less than 3 hours. It was their plan when we were all done. So, this is what we have to do. This is what your MPO has to do. This is the federal transportation law, 20-year plan, 5-year capital program, and then you have to go run it through the models for air quality. So I'm going to run through these slides very quickly. So we decided that we were going to have to reach out, just like Mayor Remza said, and we were going to have to get out in the community, and we were putting it all together. You can see how many input opportunities we had. Public workshops. So you can see in these pictures, the bottom left, that's Mary Lane Scruggs from Glendale. The top right, that's the mayor of Mesa. Why this is important is we lost an election in 1994. We were trying to renew our tax. And we had these really smart consultants from California come over and talk to us, and they said, do not put your elected officials out front, run silent, run deep, do direct mail. Well, we got our brains beat out. So when we did this in 2004, we said, no more of that. We're going to put the elected officials out front on this thing, and they're going to own this plan. You can see them in action there. We did the public hearings. We did public involvement community events. We went to where the people were. We put the booth up in the mall. Because, when you hold a hearing, it's only so many that will always come. You have to go where the folks are. We did a town hall. When we were opening freeways, as a result of that 85 tax, we were out at the freeway opening saying, hey guys, we've got some more stuff for you. We did Sunday on Central, which is the main drag in Phoenix. We went out to the Title VI communities. An interesting part, one of the ladies that testified for us in the legislature when we were getting authority, she was blind. She was standing up there with her cane, and she was saying, build this plan. Look at all these community groups. We were everywhere. We did a website. We did all of the modes. This morning I heard a little bit about what I call modalism, where you pit one against the other. You walkable communities against transit, against freeways, against arterials. Well, we don't do that. our die was cast in our region much like it is here. You know, we knew that we were already spread out, so how we're going to put an effective system in that would work for everybody. And so we were talking about all of the modes. Then we went, this is important, we kept going out to the citizens on what they wanted, because we had already been informed by the legislature, you do not bring us any plan that has light rail in it. We don't believe in light rail. So we kept asking people. We did the surveys. We did workshop priorities. Look at how much, look at that magenta or whatever it is, purple, 32%. Then we started comparing what our public involvement process was with a violet sample, same thing. This is what we got out of all of this effort. 181 miles of centerline freeway. So yeah, I know that I-10 comes through here, I-10 comes through Phoenix. Guess what? We're putting sales tax money on the interstate system. Now most regions would say that is craziness. Well, the reason we're doing that is because we had to realize that the federal government isn't coming. Mommy's not coming. So if you really want your interstate system to work well, you're going to have to go put some of that locally raised money on the interstate system because it was coming right through our community. When you start doing that, all of a sudden the eyes light up in the DOT and the Federal Highway Administration, they're thinking, what are these guys doing? This was a national highway system. But they finally got it that we had a huge place at the table. And this is what it got us. Out of all of major metro areas, except San Diego, we have the best travel time. So now let's talk, that's economic development material, right? You want to go out and you want to tell people your place is where you want to live. Moving along here. So in 2006, we won the national award for all that planning that we had done. So you might say, well, it's time to sit back and relax because you got it all done, right? 64,000 pending and foreclosed homes. So what I was really impressed with how this region really dealt with Katrina, I mean on a much smaller scale, we were just hammered. And so that forces you to start thinking differently about what you're going to do in your region. I mean, you almost have to, Carl Jung, who was a psychologist, psychiatrist, he and Nico Tinbergen won the Nobel Prize for imprinting. And it's, you know, at a certain periods in your life, you're ready to learn something. Well, I'll tell you, this was a critical period in our life, probably like Katrina was a critical period in your life. That's when all of a sudden you say, well, I guess business as usual isn't going to keep working. Here's where we're at now in Phoenix. This is kind of back to normal. This is what it did to us. I called it housing heroin. We were on housing heroin in Phoenix. The only worst place was Las Vegas. So we had to cut $6.9 billion out of a freeway program, and transit cut $2 billion. So that's a serious wake-up call when you're doing a regional planning. So what do you do? So here's the guy that championed Einstein. You know, Einstein wasn't popular, and Max Planck, who was in quantum theory, I tell you, I didn't understand quantum theory. I didn't even understand chemistry. I was doing hunting and fishing in Montana instead of the chemistry class. But this guy knew how to change his mind, and I think that's where you have to start thinking about how are you going to change your mind to get a different result here. This is a slide that we were very proud of in 1998. We got that Craftsman type toolbox. We put all the drawers in, the bigger drawers on the bottom where, you know, like the big projects like freeways and rail and all that kind of stuff. And then you can see the little boxes up there like dial-a-ride and walking. So that was our reality in 1998. And so our Federal Highway Administration person asked for this, and when I looked at it, I thought, boy, this thing's way out of date. This is 2015. So this is what your metropolitan planning organization needs to be doing. I mean, who knew about Uber in 1998? Who knew about active traffic management in 1998? So our whole world has changed. And one of the big changes that we've done is moving into economic development. If you're going down the toilet like we were, as I told our committee once, our Economic Development Committee, I said, my name is Dennis Smith. I'm not related to Will Smith, but we need to get jiggy with it here. We need to make something happen. So, I really loved all of your planning this morning, and obviously it sounds like a state that hadn't done much planning. I got to have a degree in planning. I don't believe in it, because I think it becomes a crutch for somebody not to do anything. So you plan and you plan and you plan, and you lay out the beautiful plans, and you don't get anything done. So don't get sucked into a planning vortex. So stop planning, start doing. This was one of those mornings where I couldn't sleep, 2 in the morning, watching the Business Channel, and here comes Linda Rottenberg on, and she started talking about crazy as a compliment. Entrepreneurs he met, they overthink, they overplan, they overanalyze. You spend all your time talking about ideas, learning theory, and writing business plans, and not enough time trying stuff out. And this is the best entrepreneur in Silicon Valley. I think the MPOs do this. A lot of organizations love to plan because you don't really have to go and get committed. You're not all in, you're not getting anything done. So how corporations grow and die. So this is the normal curve. And you can see when you're getting to the prime, you're up close to the top of that curve. This is when you're doing really well. This is when we passed Prop 385. We redid it in 2004, so we're feeling pretty good about ourselves. But if you're not changing what you're doing, you're going down the other way, and you're becoming a bureaucracy. You don't get anything done. So you have to ask yourself this question. You know, I know I was brought here to talk about transportation, but it's not transportation, and this is kind of the sea change that we did in our organization. Go out to a cocktail party and have a conversation about pavement cracking. And see how many people want to sit down and listen to you. But if you go out to that same cocktail party and you say, geez, I see your kid's going to graduate from LSU, that's really sad that they have to go to Austin or Seattle or somewhere else because we don't have any jobs here for your kid. All of a sudden, somebody's going to start listening to you, and then they'll say, well, how do you solve that? And you'll say, well, if we did this transportation improvement to this area of your economy, that would make them more globally competitive. So some of my metropolitan planning organization friends say, well, geez, I'm not sure that's what we're supposed to be doing. Here's the federal transportation law. Support the economic vitality of the metropolitan area, especially by enabling global competitiveness, productivity, and efficiency. It's right in the federal law. Most of my friends, and they're all my friends, they're not doing this. And maybe it's because they haven't been slapped around like we were slapped around, or you guys have been slapped around. So it's actually a good thing sometimes that you get slapped around, because then your ears are open, you're into that critical learning period, and you want to change what you're doing. Now, do we have a vested interest in the economy in our region? Sure do. So I told you, mommy's not coming. So look at that on the freeways, 51.6% sales tax. Transit, 44.3%. If we would have waited for the federal government, we would have been totally dead in the water. There's no way we could have done it. They weren't going to help us out. So my old psychology boss that I worked with right out of college when I had hair on my head in 1970, he said, Dennis, you make your own happiness. And that's a big message to you guys here. You've got the corporate community here. You've got your planning that you've been working on. You have to decide you're going to do something. The other thing we did, so I don't know how it works here, I know how it works in Phoenix. You have chambers. You have chambers of commerce everywhere. You have regional economic development organizations. And there are a lot of silos. There are cylinders of excellence all over the place in your region. They don't talk to each other. They compete with each other. And we said, well, if we're dying, and we have all the data because we have to do population projections, we have to do travel demand modeling, we have to do air quality modeling. We had the smarties working for us. We said, why don't we go put an economic development committee together, invite all those major regional organizations in, put some elected officials on, put ASU on, Thunderbird School of Global Management, things like that, sprinkle it with all the people that really could add something. Wow, that was like hitting a hornet's nest. Because like, what are you guys doing? We thought you were a transportation agency. And we said, look, we're dying here. Lead follower, get out of the way. We're going to go make something happen. And so we challenged our entire staff and said, look, if you have all the analytical tools, let's turn it to the economy. Because transportation is an enabler of the economy. Transportation is not the end. A lot of people don't get that. We went to our major firm, Greater Phoenix Economic Council. They're the ones that go out and do trying to recruit business and bring them in. And we said, and they said their website sucked. And we said, well, why don't we make you the killer website? Because we knew how to do websites. And so we put Greater Phoenix Rising, and we helped them. That was a joint effort with them. So this is for all the women here. There's Brad Pitt. So my daughter used to work for a big mortgage firm up in Connecticut, and she said, Dad, have you read Moneyball? Everybody here's reading Moneyball. I said, no, I haven't read that book. So I read it, and the story here is how the Oakland A's beat the New York Yankees with a very small payroll. They quit listening to the scouts, and they started listening to a sabermetrician back in the back room in a cube farm. And he said, I think this is who we should bring on the team. And so I said, why aren't we doing Moneyball here at MAG? Why aren't we using all these data analytics to be smarter than Texas? Texas is trying to suck the blood out of Arizona. The chupacabras, we call them, running around in the middle of the night. So we have our information services division. They started doing online mapping. Now everybody can do a map, right? MPOs are great at that, but not many people do the analysis. You go on our website, Maricopa Association of Governments, and you go right on the front page, you'll find this, where you can actually get the maps, you can get the reports. We sent our team out to every city that had an ED department and said, let's all get smarter together. I'll just give you a few examples of the data that we do. So workforce is a big deal, right? So we said, well, where are all those ASU graduates? Just like where you would say, where are all the LSU graduates? Well, nobody knew. So we went to the Alumni Association. They gave us all the data back to 1980. We mapped it by degree. And you know, one of the fallacies, we thought a lot of them had left. A lot of them were still in the valley. So we know where they're at by degree, so that when people are out trying to attract a company, they have more data, and we made it all mobile friendly. So here's ASU degrees per 100,000, per 1,000. And you can see we have some spots in the valley that aren't good, but also we have some areas that are just really high-tech areas. They're right along freeway corridors. You know, the gentleman this morning said all these high-tech companies want to go to downtown. That's not the case where we're at. The hottest corridor is the Price corridor. We also have an air quality problem. So the air quality, there's a state law that says you have to have a trip reduction program to encourage people to ride share and all that kind of stuff. We actually fund it. It's almost $1 million a year. We said, well, we're going to go ask them some more questions. So this is a survey of 500,000 people per year. So we know that this is the city of Surprise, where the people working in Surprise live, so you can see that. And then you can do the reverse and say, well, who are they sending out of town every day? Where are they going? Well, they're going to the big business center there along I-17. So the issue gets down to, why aren't you putting some of these kind of businesses over in Surprise so they're not on the road every day? And they were talking about building a university, liberal arts. We said, why aren't you building a business school over there? Because that's where the workers are. They're going over to all these really big companies up on I-17. And here's the other thing that's heresy. Cities don't talk to each other, and even within cities, silos don't talk to each other. So the planners don't talk to the economic development people. So we said, well, we're going to bring them all together in one room. And so this is a group that meets about every 6 months at our organization. We bring all of them, we're running our tools by them, they're tuning them up, telling us what we need to be doing. And this is just a wheel, because this is the wheel that demonstrates all of the projects of our Economic Development Committee. We've had ASU lose programs, grants, because they had no local support. We said, well, we can fix that. We went out and signed an agreement with ASU, University of Arizona, Northern Arizona University, said that we would support these research grants because you want the high-end research jobs. And so we started working with them, and you can see all the various activities that we're working on. Then we said, well, how are these small businesses, small and medium-sized businesses, which are the majority of the businesses in Arizona, how are they communicating? And they had no way of even knowing who each other really were. And we said, well, we're going to do eharmony.com for business. So we set our programmers, you know, you're a planning agency, you have to have programmers. We sent them to work on doing this, building an international economic network site, which you sign on to, and we're working on aligning the business in Mexico, Arizona, and Canada. So we're out there working with the smaller businesses. And this probably has some relationship to you. So we're the Great Satan, we're Phoenix, Maricopa County, but then you have Tucson. And so how do you get those two areas to work together? Because it's really a megapolitan. And we realized that we were in sales tax, probably 85% of all the sales tax in Arizona, even though we had 14 counties. And we said, well, let's at least be responsible here and put together a joint planning and advisory council. So we're meeting with them. We have a meeting coming up in January. We're bringing in Utah. Utah is a lot smarter about some of this transportation stuff than we are. We're going to pick their brain. We're also working in the Intermountain West, because we know that's the highest growth area in the United States. So we got a grant from Federal Highway Administration, and we're working on a common data platform for that. Because this is the future for Arizona. I don't know what your corridor would be, but you probably have one. Okay, I need to speed up here. So here's who our trading partners are. This is our region with Mexico. We opened an office in Mexico City. We did a map of all the international owned businesses so that the chambers could go out and work with them. Canadians, we know where all the Canadians are at in the valley. We know where all the Canadian companies are. So this is one, we're getting close to the end here. So we had a nonprofit come and say, we'd like to use your data viewers and we would like to know about education. We have mapped all of the charter and elementary schools in the state of Arizona, and you can go get all the demographics, you can get all the grades. So when somebody's trying to locate in your community, you're not getting just an average, you can zero right in and say, well, there are great schools in Arizona. So we're getting close to the end here. We're devotees of the book Good to Great. So you get the right people on the bus, the wrong people off, get them in the right seats. When in doubt, don't hire somebody, get the right person. You only win with an ace. And in the leadership part, I even hate the word. I tell all of our staff, you need to lead, because if you're just expecting it to come from one person, that means I put you in park and you're not expected to think. And we expect all of them to think. This is what it got us. This was just about 3 weeks old. Best driving experience in the world, Phoenix, Arizona. This is the app that tracks traffic. So we're quite proud of that. I just want to finish with one thing, because I think when I was 1977, I was a criminal justice planner at the Maricopa Association of Governments, and I was handing out the criminal justice money. I went down to 7th Step, which was a halfway house type for people coming out of Florence Prison. And I talked to Monty McKenzie. I thought I was being really smart. I said, Monty, what's the treatment modality that you use here at 7th Step? And he was an ex-convict. He looked me dead in the eye and he said, Dennis, it doesn't matter what treatment modality you have. It matters if you have the want to. That's the real challenge to this group. You've done a lot of planning. Now you got to decide if you have the want to go make your own happiness. Thank you.
I am going to jump right in to where we are and kind of some of the transportation issues that we're seeing in our region. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about transportation on a regional scale. And the fact that if I were to back up here for a second, when I was putting this slide together and I wrote our regional transportation system, I just want you to know that the fact that we can even call it a regional transportation system is in and of itself a new idea for the region that I live in, and here's why. So yes, and this has been touched on briefly, we have not only the constraints of federal funding that doesn't exist anymore, state funding that doesn't exist anymore, all of those issues that come with transportation that we're suffering from across the country. We are also sitting in a tri-state region. So we are in a region that has 3 DOTs on top of the US DOT, and all of those complexities 3 metropolitan planning organizations bring to it as well. However, when you look at that map, yes, we absolutely function as a region, right? I mean, you can look there and you know that we are traveling throughout that place. Clearly, you'll see on there Chattanooga right there in the center. We have Northwest Georgia, where Dalton is, in Whitfield County, so the carpet capital of the world. And then over to 2 counties in Alabama. Great, beautiful outdoor place. Entire region is known for its outdoor beauty. But because of that topography, we have found ourselves with constraints that we weren't expecting because we were just taking for granted the way that we moved around this region. Here's another example of what you guys I know are seeing as well. So here's some recent articles, right? Tennessee fuel tax revenues are not expected to be sufficient for the state's road system. Take a look at the next one. So this is on I-75 in Georgia. And GDOT, you know, they're talking about the fact that, sure, we've got an interstate system that's very heavily traveled, that I-75 corridor in our region that comes up from the very bottom of Florida all the way up to the northeast coast. Can't fix the problems that we're experiencing on our existing infrastructure. And then to zone down into our county, this is Chattanooga's county, Hamilton County, the realities that face our local governments and understanding that it's not just a problem statewide, it's not just a problem on a federal level, but it's also a problem for our local governments to keep up with maintaining what we've already got. So these complexities were coming at us in very different silos because of the jurisdictions that we are set up under. And it wasn't until we pulled out commuting maps. And those commuting maps really opened our eyes that if it was going to take a group, an entity, to start talking about our transportation problems, we were going to have to start unveiling the realities of a region that is very dependent on each other and is very dependent on the infrastructure system that flows throughout our region in order to access jobs, in order to access our places of employment and our school and our education and just our regular quality of life. We knew there was a reality coming at us, but yet we hadn't begun to talk about it. And I'm going to stop there for a second, and just because I'm noting our time, I zoomed right through the fact that I want to point out. Thrive is in and of itself a public-private citizen-led, it is a grassroots effort. And it is driven very heavily by all 3 of our sectors, which means the public, the private, and the nonprofit philanthropic sectors. They're all at the table doing this. And so for the first time, pulling these types of things out, it took a group of interested citizens and business leaders and elected officials that wanted to see us do something different to really come out and say, we need somebody outside of our silos to de-silo us and pull our interests together and start looking at the bigger picture. And that's what we're doing. So when you look at that picture and you see where the traffic, where all of our commuters, where are the folks going? And I want you to think about your communities and your regions and your next door neighbors. And when we think about how a road project or any kind of multimodal project might not be in your particular area, it's most certainly going to benefit the entire area that you live in on a larger scale. So when we looked at those traffic flows, here's the realities of our major infrastructure. And you'll see we had interstate systems in place that went north to south, but nothing that goes east to west. And that's because of the river that runs right through. It's very difficult, as you all know better than I. It's very difficult to just build a bridge, right? It's also very difficult to go over or through a mountain. And in our case, we have mountains that definitely constrain our geography. But not only that, we have this list of challenges, one of which is impaired freight congestion. And so when we look at our region and we think about transportation and how we're moving, we have to look at it from a very broad lens and find local, very community-driven solutions in order to correct them and solve them. And it was a very eye-opening experience. You heard in my introduction, Rachel's introduction of me, I come from a very downtown, vibrant background. And to start to think about something like freight is a new concept, but it's a reality that we all are living in. And I know that it is existing in here as well and all across the country. But 80% of the freight that travels through our region doesn't start or stop there. It just passes through. And so we also understand that freight is what messes up the roads much more than cars, but we have to address it and we have to find ways in order to move our people and our products most efficiently in light of these other challenges. So the last one on there was no tri-state transportation project coordination. Here's an example of the 3 metropolitan planning organizations that we have in our region. And the red line is the Chattanooga. Down in the bottom, the green is the Dalton-Whitfield County Metropolitan Planning Organization, their long-range transportation plans, and then up above in the dark blue is Cleveland, Tennessee's. I put that out there to say, for the very first time, we were able to put that on a map and realize there was no coordination that had ever occurred before. And you might have one jurisdiction that's thinking about doing a project that connects into another jurisdiction, but they're not talking. Whether that be something that's going to utilize your rail or something that's going to utilize a highway. But without just simply talking, we were not being efficient with our government dollars. And in this case, I just want to point out that when you put together the cost of the long-range transportation plans from those that are fiscally constrained, so we wait until the funding is available, but it's been put on the list, there's $5 billion worth of projects, and then another $5 billion in illustrative, things that we may never see in our lifetime. So $10 billion for a mid-sized city, a small region in comparison to where we are right now, is very significant. And the majority of that is simply maintaining what we already have. And we can't just let that fall by the wayside. We have another constraint that is existent across everyone across this country. We want to be more fuel efficient. We want our automobiles and our cars to run much more efficiently. But look what that does to our revenues. And so when we hear the feds and we hear state governments tell us that there is no more funding, they're not kidding. You look at what the average mile per gallon was in 1990, 28 miles per gallon. You jump ahead to 2025, knowing that our automobiles are going to continue being more efficient. It's estimated to be a 54 mile per gallon estimate. So you see what that does to revenues. So while you have an increase in needs of maintaining what you've got, you have a decrease in the revenues that are coming in order to keep up with the pace. In the case of Tennessee, the gas tax had not been increased since 1989. It still hasn't. So you also have that. You just have so many things that are working against you when you're thinking about how you're going to fund transportation. And back onto the freight and what we see, and this is an actual example of, almost on a daily basis, our interstate. Because of all the trucks that you see going down there before I put the box up, but also the stop. I mean, you lose one part of your major corridor through your region, and your whole region shuts down in essence. But here's some interesting stats just to put that back out there, and these are the realities that we have to work with. And I think the one of most importance I want to point out is when we want a more efficient way of doing things, when we have problems that cause us to be congested, an idling truck consumes approximately 1 gallon of fuel per hour. And so these are the things that are not energy efficient. These are the things that do not help our businesses, do not help our economy, and we all, if we're sitting in the car, are completely frustrated by sitting there as well. I want to show you what's going to happen just from the other standpoint. Transportation absolutely matters to the way that we grow, and it needs to be there to support the things on how we grow. And so through our process, we looked at how we were going to grow over the next 40 years. And here's an example of the population density. And if we were not planning and we were not thinking about how we want to grow, and we were just continuing to allow it to kind of happen to us, that's the way it's trending. And I'll go back and forth one more time just to show. And when you're looking at it from that standpoint, transportation heavily comes in there, and it might be very easy to throw out the idea. In our case, and we had talked about a bypass. We had talked about things that we thought were the easy solutions. But here's an example. You know, we have these gorgeous, beautiful places. And when we put in this picture, it's a new interchange that's gone along the interstate. And I'll back that one. And this is not in our region, by the way. So I am not calling our region out. But here's on I-40. So here it is today. Does growth happen all around where you put the interchange in? Yes. But what did it just do to the land use pattern? And has it actually added more congestion to that intersection and that part? And I just have to do it again because it's so compelling. It's a major shopping industry now, but it is not an easy place to drive and get through. So what are we going to do? I know that these are things that we are going to continue to look at, but what are we going to do? You know what we're going to do? We're going to look at accessing our existing assets. Look at the freight that can be traveled up our waterways. And I had a conversation yesterday about the Mississippi River and coming up, cargo that's going to be traveling up into the Memphis area. And think about using the existing assets that you have, but also never forget to protect them. And in our process, we have all of those players sitting at the same table. But look at those alternative routes. It's already there. It can move things through. Also, look at our freight. Look at our freight moving on the rail line. So here's an example of the rail line that connects down into New Orleans that comes all the way up. We have lots of rail lines throughout this country that are already there that can very easily move our cargo and keep it off the roads. And it's just one solution that is much more palatable than the billions and billions dollars worth of infrastructure improvements that we were looking at. Because of those types of ways to look at how we move people and products, we had a recent announcement made for an Appalachian regional port. And I put the map up there. If you look on the far right corner where it says Georgia, it's a very rural county that doesn't even have an interstate. But because they understand the issues our region is facing, they found a way to leverage their existing asset to help the rest of the region and then also be an economic boom for their community. So they're using the multimodal solutions. You also could take a look at the multimodal that we use in our very urban, compact, dense downtown. So we have, through this process, we had a person that's leading it that represents one of our major industries and was consistently thinking about the answer being building new roads. And as we learned more about the fiscal constraints that we're facing and the shortfalls that we already have, maintaining what we already have, had to start looking at other things. And when you look at that picture, you think, well, that is not going to help with congestion. But as more people use bikes, you can't put the freight on a bike, but you can put a commuter. And to pull them off the interstate, which I'm one, I've done it, it's awesome, and it's a great way to think about lessening the car and lessening the impact that you're gonna have on the roads. And it's just another option. Everything should be about choices, and it shouldn't be taking choices away, but adding to them. Here is the way that we have ended our vision, and this is going to be where I end it now. But again, when it comes down to it, we are looking at how we can move people and products around the region. And I'm going to reiterate a point that's been made today. Dennis said it, we keep saying this. Transportation is not the end. It is the supporting element to the things that we need, that we treasure, that we value, that make us more economically prosperous. And in this case, when you look at that list, you know what? It's really important that we try to find a way so that we can spend more time in our destination instead of on the way to it. We all grew up saying, are we there yet? Are we there yet? Nobody likes it. We're born not liking it. We also want to reduce the operating costs for our businesses. And we also want to see our tax dollars spent more efficiently. What a concept. If there is a major project in your region that needs to happen, such as a major infrastructure change, the best thing that you can possibly do is to get the whole region on board with it so that you actually put all hands on deck and make it happen while looking at these other solutions to also try to complement and help with that. Because at the end of the day, you want to be able to improve your accessibility to our businesses, our hospitals, our schools, our places of employment, our parks, our outdoor spaces, the things that make us love the communities that we live in. So with that, I will turn it back over to Rachel for your questions.
Thank you. And so I'm going to take the liberty of asking a couple of questions myself. Three, very different presentations, but I think one thing that came to mind I really wanted to ask you about some specific creative, low-cost, short-term solutions to mobility that might be working in your regions or that might be part of the solutions that have been discussed in Chattanooga. Can you comment about some of those?
Sure, and I touched on it a little bit with the Appalachian Regional Port, and as there was discussion from industry about a bypass, that ended up being a solution that doesn't involve billions and billions of dollars of a new road. And so in that case, through our dialogue talking about some of the issues that we faced, Murray, that's an example of through this process, the county commissioner of that county sat at the table. We all got behind her with this inland port. And now with a $23 million project that CSX was actually instrumental in putting half, if not a little over half of the portion of that into it to fund it, $23 million versus billions of dollars is definitely a quick win, and it's a innovative solution, and it will be up and running within 3 years versus the amount of time that it would have taken to build something to move the freight that hadn't already been there.
Well, in our region, sometimes, the Department of Public Safety, that's the Highway Patrol in Arizona, and the DOT, they get along, but they don't get along sometimes. And if any of you are driving on a freeway, if there's an accident, oftentimes there's a secondary collision. You run into somebody because traffic is slowing down. And so this idea had been out for quite a while. We have a traffic operations center run by the DOT. And our safety people were saying, we need a DPS officer in that operations center. And so we talked to the DOT and said, look, we'll fund so many years if you fund so many years. And now we have a reduction in the number of secondary collisions on the freeway system. And so that was not concrete. That was operations and making the freeway safer for the people.
I think about how the consensus is formed and how priorities and projects and trends are always changing, the nature of planning, the nature of projects. And so in terms of determining your region's priorities, are they constantly shifting or are they pretty solid?
Well, in our region, when we passed that tax in '85, we made the mistake of implementing the program like a DOT normally would do, where you have that 5-year capital program and you have a 20-year plan, and so the first 5 are nailed down and the other 15 aren't. We had a performance audit done in our region and said, are you guys crazy? You have a 20-year tax, you need a 20-year program. So we have it all lined up, not only for freeways, we have it all for 20 years of transit and 20 years of streets. And so there's more certainty, and that really helps the development community, because if you want to go develop somewhere, you'll say, well, I know in 2022 there's going to be a freeway there. And so that was one of the improvements that we did.
I think in our case, we have been very focused on the big picture. Our regional vision is educated people with good jobs living in a great place. And so when we look at transportation projects and other things, we have to be flexible to the changes that might come with time. But at the same time, we need to be focused on making sure that what we do enhances the great place component of that vision and that it supports the quality of life. And those are the things that keep us grounded as we move forward. And 5 years ago, we wouldn't have even thought of the port as something, because we're inland, right? I mean, who would even think of that? But as the opportunity and the conversation continued to evolve, we were flexible with that as long as it was helping us achieve those things that we wanted to achieve at the end of the day. And the same with the bike share. 5 years ago, we didn't have that in downtown Chattanooga. And now we do, and that's a simple fix. When you compare that to an Appalachian regional port, it's a simple fix, but it's absolutely making us find multimodal ways to move around and alternative opportunities for travel that we wouldn't have thought of otherwise.
So I think your question was really about stability over time in priorities, and I'd say that although they did evolve and change somewhat over a period of a couple of decades, that there was a fair amount of stability on at least the major projects, and if not, we wouldn't have been able to get some things done. In particular, the biggest project for our region for quite a few years was the Silver Line, the extension of Metro to Tysons Corner and Dulles Airport, so that in a couple of years now, if you fly into Dulles, you'll be able to get on a train and take it all the way downtown. And even more importantly, connecting it to the biggest job center in our region that didn't have any rail transit, which was Tysons Corner. And that was something that was envisioned in the 1960s, talked a lot about in the 70s and 80s, argued a lot about in the 90s, and nearly killed in the 2000s, but which a little over a year ago did finally open the first phase. The second phase, all over the airport, will open in about 2 years. That had to be a priority for the region, and we had to say it was a priority. We had to keep it a priority through a lot of different administrations, federal and state. And so that was really important. But I'd say that doesn't mean there weren't lots of efforts to change the priorities. And so one of the things that I think was important was sort of continually revalidating was necessary. We had people, for instance, who were going to oppose a multi-billion-dollar project, and it takes a lot to convince people that they actually do want this. And so we even things, for instance, we did a survey. We had commissioned a so-called scientific survey. In part because some of my colleagues felt that just holding hearings and seeing who shows up, the same people tend to show up. and they wanted to get a broader, broader view. And so we did some pretty extensive surveying, and could show actually the support was even higher than we imagined. And that kept it alive at times when it could easily have died.
Well, I hate to draw us to a close, but I'm afraid we are running out of time. So I want to thank our panelists today. And I wanted to quickly say that if you have enjoyed this event, and this is our 10th anniversary of hosting this great event, I hope you'll consider becoming a member of CPEX. I think we have a bright next decade that we are excited about. So if you are interested in that, please go to our website and consider becoming a member. And so next up in this room, we have Secretary Anthony Fox. So if you take a break, please be back in your seats for 3 o'clock. Thank you.